Welcome everyone. Today we are having a look at the shaders. They can be a bit complex, so I wanted to make a video explaining every shader in detail. You can find timestamps to all the different shaders if you need to reference this video later for like some specific effect. But for now, let's do a small intro, as in what is a shader when we're talking about shaders. The shaders basically are special effects in practice. Under the hood, it's basically code that runs directly on the GPU. It's written in like GPU language. So it lets you make effects that run very fast performance-wise. In 3D Canvas, you can access the shaders by hitting the Configure Shaders button. You can find this usually in the Effects tab. If the specific object does not have subtabs, it will just be at the bottom of the 3D tab. For today, we are just going to focus on shaders, on tokens, but mainly tiles. So to open the shader configuration, just hit the button on whichever object you want to apply the shader to. And you will be met with this little window here. So now we will start looking at the shaders. We will start with the idle shader. We will go in order. And this idle shader, we are on the token because the idle shader is meant for tokens. All the shaders can be used on anything, so you can use any of these shaders on a token or on a tile. But some of the shaders are meant for something specific. So for example, the first shader, the idle shader, is, as I said, meant for tokens. To enable a shader, we just hit the enable button and the shader will be enabled on this token. You can see that this idle shader is meant to show some sort of idle animation to give a bit of movement to otherwise static tokens. And you can see that the token is slightly breathing. This is meant to be a very subtle effect. You can bump it up to see what it's actually doing. So if we bump the intensity, you will see that the token is kind of moving in a wavy fashion, but the intention is to have this at a very low intensity. So let's see what all these numbers do, because every shader has some number of parameters you can configure. So speed is how fast this effect is applied. So if we select 0.6, for example, it's going to go very fast. Of course, we don't really want this in this shader, but for the example, let's put it like a bit higher. Changing the direction, as you can see, will change which way it's waving, so to say, so to speak. And the intensity is how much it will wave. And the anchor percentage is how much of the token will be having this effect starting from the bottom. So if we are at anchor 0 or 0.01, it's going to start from the feet of the token. But if we increase this value, as you can see now, the feet are completely I've completely stopped animating, and as we go up, less and less of the token will animate. Depending on a 3D model, this value may vary and the percentage might not be exact. There are some limitations when working with shaders, so keep that in mind that you might need to tweak this number a bit depending on the model. But yeah, the idea is to have like some sort of idle animation. I suggest leaving these values at something like this with 0.1, 0.2 intensity. So when the token is here, it will have this like very subtle movement that will make the token like look more alive if you look at him closely. Next, let's move to the wind shader. So for the wind shader, we have here on the scene a couple of different objects that are going to help us use the wind shader. This is just a tree placed from the asset browser, and this is just some grass placed from the asset browser, then merged together. So let's start from this tree. So as you might think, the wind shader will help us give some more life, some movement to our scene, giving the illusion of wind to some of our nature elements. To enable the wind shader, as with all other shaders, we just enable with this checkbox. Now here we have some parameters we can tweak. So as it is by default, our wind will move in a specific direction. You can see that this tree is basically moving left to right with direction 0. If I place it at like roughly 90, it's going to go like up, down. And this is the direction of our wind. Obviously, the speed is how fast this effect is played. So you can see that if we set it higher, it's going to wiggle aggressively. And the intensity is how much it's wiggling. So if we set it to like 2, you can see it's going to go way, it's going to bend quite a lot in that specific direction. And the anchor, similar to the idle shader, is where the effect starts. So if we have it at 50%, only the top half of the tree is going to animate. If we reduce it, as you can see, it's going to go way below, and so on. I suggest leaving this as 50% generally, unless you need like to do something specific. And convoluted is going to change basically the direction of the animation and make it more random. So if we enable it, we can see that instead of going up and down, it's moving a lot and it's kind of expanding and contracting. So at the moment, we have a very like high intensity effect, but if we lower the intensity to more reasonable numbers, you can see that we end up with like a more randomized movement that can help, especially in, I suggest this one if you're trying to simulate like very heavy wind. So maybe like increase the speed a bit, increase the intensity a bit with the convoluted, and you can have like a pretty powerful wind going on of some sort. And then our last thing is the ground blending. And for the ground blending, I wanted to use the grass because it makes more sense. So let's pick this grass and let's see what this ground blending is all about. So as always, we enable the wind shader and just leave it at default. We already know what the rest of the stuff does. The ground blending, I'm gonna leave the white color, so it's way more visible, but it's gonna color the tips of the object starting from the bottom of a specific, we're using a specific color. So in this example, this grass is already like pretty much blended. But if we wanted to blend it more, or if the ground, for example, was more brownish in color, we can give it this effect. If we have like, for example, more like autumn leaves kind of a background, we can give it like a more orangey look. So the idea is that by using this, we can kind of match the color of the ground. So you can use this color picker here. It's kind of useful. You kind of pick like your average color of the ground here, and we'll just like color it that way. So this is what this is for. And if you increase the slider, it's going to color more and more of the grass. Without it, it looks like this. With just this green, it looks like this. It's a bit more blended. It's not by no means necessary, but it does help in some scenes to make it more cohesive, especially if you have like some grass that has like an odd color or something. Let's grab the distortion shader. So this is generally pretty decent for lava and effects such as that. It's basically a kind of like moving water effect, but it's a bit more random. So if we enable it, you will see that this thing starts like kind of moving horizontally and having like this kind of displacement. So this is the very simple kind of effect. If we enable convoluted, you will see that it's like stretching way more. So I suggest using something like this with usually a slower speed and possibly a higher intensity. So you can see like now it's pretty much very exaggerated, but the idea of this effect is like a very simple and cheap effect to give some movement to some surface that you want to kind of like move around a bit. We're gonna now look at the water. So we have both water and ocean. So you might be asking like, okay, what are these? Why are these two things? Water is a more simple and very cheap effect for a kind of water-like effect. Ocean is a more like ocean wave simulation. It's more expensive, more realistic, and all those nice things. So let's enable the water effect, which is the first one we're gonna see. You can see we have like clearly this like big wave going on. So this effect only has this single wave. We can increase the wave density. As you can see, we have more waves. And for this shaders, I'm gonna increase the Dynamesh resolution so that we have a bit more vertices to work with and see like the effect a bit better. And you can see that we basically have this like single like sine wave. You can pretty clearly see here that is going along and displacing this water. And if we change the direction, we can change the direction this sine wave is going. It's very easy to direct. Of course, you wouldn't probably use like such high waves, but just exaggerating for the example. But you can have like a pretty simple moving water. If you just need like a very simple movement, maybe with like lower density so you don't see all the repetition or something like this, you can have this very simple moving water. Of course, you can increase the speed as always to make this go faster. But this is your like go-to cheap effect if you just need some super simple water, like in a well or something. If you don't need to make like a whole ocean, or like you don't need to make a lake or something, like for smaller bodies of water, or like maybe you have a liquid in a barrel, all that kind of stuff. This shader is like your go-to because it's super cheap. Now let's move on to the ocean shader, which is the more complex water simulation. There are a ton of parameters here. I'm gonna do my best to explain them in the simple way possible. But first, let's just enable the shader. Most of the times, you only need to mess with like these first three parameters. As you can see, this will generate this ocean simulation, this wave simulation, which is way more realistic than the simple water shader. And we have some parameters. So let's look at this. Generally, by messing with this two, you're gonna go get 90% of the way there. The speed is, of course, how fast the waves are moving. So if we set it to 0.6, it's gonna go very fast. 0.1 as a decent speed. And we can increase the scale of the waves. This is a bit too much increased. I don't know where the water went. So be careful with some parameters. So let's go to 0.1. And you can see we have very small waves here. 0.2, we will have a bit bigger waves. So most of the time, just by messing with this scale parameter, you're gonna get whatever ocean simulation you want. For this demo, let's set it to a bit higher value so we can actually see what's going on here. So this is a pretty like decently sized waves that we can clearly see. And now we can change these parameters. So the way this specific shader works, this simulation works, is by adding up 3 waves together. Under the hood, it does like more math to generate more waves, but it uses this like 3 primary waves to generate everything else. And you can change these parameters to change how tall the waves are. So you can see by changing the steepness, we have more pointy waves. By changing direction, we have one of the waves going in a different direction than the other. And this, like, it's very kind of hard to see because they're like added together. It's very hard to see how changing one parameter changes like the whole thing. And the wavelength is like how dense that specific wave is. So how many ups and downs it has in like a specific amount of like distance. So if we reduce the wavelength, as you can see, we have a different density here. If we increase it, we have more sparse waves. Now, my suggestion is to simply leave these values as default. And if you want, you can fiddle a bit with these waves to kind of change how the ocean looks. But most of the times you are just going to like leave this as default and just change the scale and the speed, and you're gonna be pretty much set with that. Like these are meant to be advanced things if you really want to tweak exactly how your ocean looks like, how like point it is. Maybe you want to change the steepness if you have like a pretty big storm and you want to add some more steepness to it, some more pointy waves and stuff like that. But as I said, most of the times you're just gonna change these two values and that's it. You have the highlights to give a bit of a white highlighting to the waves if you like this look better. But otherwise, you're mostly gonna just change these two values and call it a day. Our next shader is the orbit shader. For this shader, I've placed this crystal here to kind of show what this thing can do, as it's gonna be primarily used for this kind of objects. So what I'm thinking here is we have like a magic crystal in a room, like maybe it's on top of some magic pedestal, or you have a magic circle on the bottom of it. It can be whatever. And we want this to have some movement. So the orbit shader, if we enable it, is going to start moving this object. So as you can see, there are two components to this orbit shader. There's the orbit speed, orbit radius, and the pivot speed. So let's set everything to 0 so we can see what's going on here. So first, let's change the pivot speed, which is the last value, but it works on its own. So we set to 0.5. This is the speed the object is gonna spin on itself. So by changing this value, the object is gonna simply rotate on itself. Then we have the orbit speed and radius. So if we set the orbit speed to something, nothing is gonna happen, as you can see, because we don't have an orbit radius. So let's set the pivot speed to 0, so we remove it from the equation. And let's set the orbit radius to 1. And you can see that now the object is orbiting around its center at this 0.5 speed. If we change it to 0.1, it's gonna go slower. And we can go even slower. And we can combine these two effects to have the object rotate and pivot. You can use this for many things. This is just a simple example, but you could have like a school of fishes that's like going around in the water, or you can have a bird that's like kind of doing like orbiting overhead and projecting like a shadow to give more life to your scene. Just place like 2 or 3, set the speed to low, and you have like some extra movement. Or you can use it as this to like highlight some important object, something that can be looted, or some other like magic thing. You can use it to even like rotate a gear, for example, if you have like gears, cogs, and stuff like that in your scene. It can be used to basically give like a simple animation to many objects. Let's get to the bounce shader. So the bounce shader has like a bit more parameters. I'm just gonna enable it for now. By default, you can see that the object is basically simply bouncing up and down. As always, you can increase or decrease the speed to change the amount it's bouncing. And by changing the intensity, you change how much it's bouncing. So the speed determines like how fast, and intensity determines how far it goes. Here, you can change which axis is affected by this bounce. So by default, you're gonna have like 1 on the z-axis. That means like apply the full intensity to the z-axis and no intensity to the x and y-axis. So if we set this to 0, it's not gonna move, and if we go 1 to the y-axis, it's gonna move sideways. If we increase the intensity, it's gonna move sideways more. And we can of course combine this to give it like a different directional effect. We can go negative to go the other way. And we can even use different numbers here if we want it to move more in the y-axis and just like a bit on the z-axis. And you can see it's doing this like very slight diagonal movement. Our next shader is the clipping shader, which is a new addition. To examine this shader, I've added a simple room made using the Dungeons and Interiors tools that we're going to use to show off what this clipping shader does. So I've currently selected the walls. We don't really care about the floor for this shader. And we're gonna select the clipping shader. So if we enable this shader directly, you can see that nothing is really gonna happen. So let's head to the token controls and select a token. So this shader requires a token to be selected. And as you can see, depending on our proximity to walls and such, this shader is basically going to hide the walls. So let's change some parameters here. If we reduce the height offset, which is why we were not seeing anything, we will see that this wall is getting hidden around our token. So if we move the token, you can see that this effect moves with the token. So this works in proximity to the token, and we can change this height offset if we want more of the wall to show. As you can see here, we have this kind of like nice effect that hides part of the wall, and it makes it easier for players to kind of see the token and interact with it. If we change the radius to like something like 200, you can see that the effect is only gonna apply in a very small radius around the token. This is probably too much of a small amount to really matter. 300 is gonna make a more significant change and show the token behind the walls. And we have this effect. As you can see, there is this kind of nice effect here around the edges of the wall that we can also change. So the speed refers, in fact, to the speed of this effect. So if we set this to 0.7, you can see it's gonna move way faster. I suggest, honestly, to use a very slow speed for this. And we also have the noise scale here, which is how big is the noise effect that's applied here. If we set to 0.1, you will see that we have this very like fine grain here. And as we increase this value, we have like more and more big kind of like edges. So you can choose if you like more something like this, or if you just want the edge to be something like this here. We have more options for this that we're gonna look at. So we have use camera and use advanced camera calculations. What does this do? So let's enable use camera. So with use camera, what's gonna happen here is that the effect is gonna apply depending on how far you are with your camera to the object. So if you're gonna use this one, I suggest having generally a bigger radius. So you can see that if you start zooming in into like some object and you're close with the camera to this object, the object is going to be hidden with the same exact effect. So the same scale, noise scale and speed applies, and it does this nice effect. This is a very like simple alternative if you don't want to use the distance to the token. Like this way, if there is like an enemy here, for example, it's still gonna work. Otherwise, it's just gonna work off the selected token if you don't have this use camera enabled. And if you want the advanced camera calculations, this is considerably more complex, and it's basically gonna check if the wall is between the token you have selected and the camera. So at the moment, I can freely see the token, so the effect is not active. But as soon as the wall is blocking the token, the effect activates. And for this one, you can use a similar radius to the token one. And you can see that while I have the camera, my view being blocked, the effect is applied. But as soon as my view is not blocked, the effect is no longer applied. And you can use this on multiple objects at the same time, and they're going to kind of work together. Please keep in mind that if you use this advanced camera on a very large amount of objects, you might experience like some popping of the objects, because as you can see, when as soon as my view is blocked, the object is going to disappear. So it can give you this like slight popping effect. If you don't like it, you can still simply disable the advanced camera calculations. Our next shader is going to be the grid shader. So this shader, as the name suggests, will project the grid onto a specific tile. You simply enable it, and you can see we have the grid here. And this matches the Foundry grid, and everything. It works on axis and all the various grid sizes. So we have a couple of settings here that we can take a look at. Mainly, we are interested about this normal calling and height calling. I'm just gonna briefly mention the show bounds. You can 99% of the time ignore this one. This is supposed to show this bound. You can see that like here where the padding ends and the nothing begins, there is like this a thicker line, and there is also a thicker line here to show the area where the padding is, where the padding starts. So padding starts here, padding ends here, nothing after this. And you're not gonna need it on normal tiles. It's mostly used internally for the table texture here. And the other two parameters, which are way more interesting, is the normal calling and height calling. So I'm gonna just briefly move this water up in the sky here. I mean, I just can delete it. It's easier to see. So let's see the height calling first. So the height calling is set to 1. This means it's not gonna call anything. So if we lower it, you can see that as we lower it, we are gonna basically call the grid on objects that are taller. At the moment, due to how this thing is kind of structured, is not gonna do anything. But as you can see here, if this object is taller, we can cut off the grid on top. So we have the grid on the bottom, but we have no grid on the top. This is pretty situational, but it's nice to know that it's there in the event that you need it. And our next thing is going to be, so we can keep this to 1. I'm going to check the normal calling, which is usually the one you're going to use the most. So normal calling, it's going to call the grid based on the direction of the surface. So let me try to make this as clear as possible. The more this normal calling is close to 1, the more the grid is only gonna show on flat surfaces. So this is flat, it shows the grid. This is flat, it shows the grid. This is vertical, it doesn't show the grid. So if we set this lower, this appears. And as we go up and up and up, if we zoom in here, you can see clearly that the grid starts like disappearing, starting from the middle where it's more vertical, and then arriving here. This is a very nice effect that I generally suggest using. And because you generally don't really use the grid on these vertical surfaces, and it tends to kind of look kind of bad when you have the grid like all over here. And setting this to like 0.8 or something, usually it's enough to get this nice effect. The grid color and grid opacity is gonna be taken from your scene settings. So whatever you have set here is gonna be used for the grid shader as well. Now let's go to the scroll shader. So this is a texture effect that is gonna simply scroll the texture. There's really nothing more to it. If we enable it, we are checking out this cube, you can see that the texture will start scrolling. It's as simple as that. We can change the direction to have the texture scroll in a different direction. And we can change the speed here to have different scrolling speed. We can have a different speed per axis here. And you can create some interesting effects with your scrolling. Of course, this cube is not exactly a very practical application, but the simplest application you can have is, for example, if you have like a water surface here and you want a bit more movement, you can enable the scroll shader here and the water will move slightly. You can even give it like a very, very slow speed, and it's going to give a bit more movement to your water. The next shader we are going to look at is the rotate shader, which, similar to the scroll shader, is going to rotate instead of scrolling the texture. If we enable it, we can see that the texture starts rotating along its center, and we can change some values here. So we have the speed, which can be like 0.5, 0.1, depending on how fast you want it. And you have the anchor. So when you change the anchor, you have to be a bit careful, because if these values are different, it's going to create some kind of distortions. This means you can kind of play and have like this kind of weird effects. Usually, you're probably gonna use the 0.5 to have it like rotate along the center, or you can have 0, to rotate along one of the corners, and you can have combinations of like 0 and 1 to rotate on other sides, for example. As you can see, like the more these values are different from each other, the weirder the effect you're gonna get. This can be interesting if you have like some kind of a strange magical effect you want to create, and you can add this texture distortion to kind of achieve that. There is also this angle offset. So let's see what this does. What this is really useful for is because you can use this rotate shader not to animate. So if you set the speed to 0 and you want, for some reason, you want this texture to be rotated like 90 degrees, you can do so with the rotate shader. So remember that this angle offset, it really is like pretty much useless if you're animating, because it's not gonna change anything. It's just gonna change the start position of the texture, but it's eventually gonna reach this angle anyways. But this way, you can rotate your texture if you're not animating it. Next, we're gonna look at the fire shader, which is kind of in the family of the fire, ice, lightning, and oil. These are all effects that are applied on top of the texture and are generated using a random noise, basically. So let's enable the fire shader and see what happens here. So as you can see, this cube now looks like it's set on fire. And of course, I'm using this cube as a demo, but you can use it like on a building, like on any 3D model from the asset browser or anything else. And you can even use it on tokens. If you didn't know, tokens have this special menu here where you can quickly enable shaders. So if you want to just like quickly enable the fire shader on this guy, there you go. Now he's on fire, and you can just like click it again to disable. So these are very useful both on tokens and like on buildings if you want special effects, but you can even make like some kind of portals or stuff like that. So let's say, for example, this cube was not a cube, but was in fact a sphere. So if we give it like a bit more polygons with the dynamic mesh resolution, we can kind of flatten the sphere, do something like this, give it like a different texture, which is like more maybe magic-like or something. Doesn't really matter what you use, because it's gonna be mostly covered by fire, but you can give it like something like this. I don't know, but you can create some kind of like portal effect like this. And the fire shader has the intensity, which is like how much it is applied to the object. It's not exactly the opacity, but it's something like similar to that. You have the scale, which is gonna dictate how dense this fire is. And you can even change the color if you want something like this. And as I said, this can create like this maybe blue portal effect, especially if we use like lower scales and lower speeds. And then we have the mix blending, which is basically gonna give you like a darker look. It's gonna add the colors together, gonna multiply the colors together instead of adding them up. So it's gonna make the darker parts darker and the lighter parts lighter. Our next shader is the ice shader. We're gonna keep using this kind of a sort of a portal kind of thing. And let's enable the ice shader. This, as you can see, will give this frosted effect. And you can see it's slightly moving. This is the default it's set at. And as before, we still have the mix blending, which does the same thing. And we have a bit more settings. So of course we have the speed, which as we know at this point kind of does always the same thing. It's like how fast the effect goes. Intensity, same thing, how much this effect is applied to the surface. The grain is how much there's like kind of lines. It's a bit hard to describe, but like you can see it becomes more liney the higher you go, I guess you can say. And at lower values, it creates a kind of a different effect. So you can even use this for something more interesting. It makes something more similar to the oil shader that we will see later. We have the scale, which as always is going to make the effect more dense. And we have the color if we want a different kind of effect. So this is the ice shader, and we're going to go forward and check the next shader, which is the lightning shader. So I'm going a bit quick with these ones because like after explaining the fire, they're all pretty much similar. So you can enable the lightning shader and it's going to create this pretty sick lightning effect. So you have your own ball of lightning. As always, speed always does the same thing, makes it faster. Intensity, same thing. Scale is gonna change the density. So if you want like 0.1, it's gonna make this basically flashing effect because it's extremely zoomed in. This is gonna make this like nice lighting effect. And let's go back to 1. We can obviously change the color and make this like a green lightning. Mix blending, as always, darkers are darker, lighter colors are lighter. And our next shader to finish it off with this like special kind of effect shaders is the oil shader. If we enable it, we're gonna have this very like strange oily effect. I'm gonna change the scale a bit so we can see it a bit better here. But you can see that this has this very like odd morphing kind of color. As always, the speed makes it faster. Let's leave it to 0.2 as this is meant to be like an almost static effect. The intensity is gonna make it stronger. So let's have a bigger intensity to see it better, and we can change the color. So the oil shader is a bit more peculiar with the color, as you cannot like exactly pick what color it is. You can pick like one of the colors and the other color is gonna kind of do its own thing. But you can see that like this specific highlight here is taking like this, the color you're telling it to pick, and the rest is kind of automatically filling in the blanks, so to speak. The mix blending, as always, it's gonna do the same thing, but with this shader, it behaves a bit different, mainly because the shader is a bit darker on its own. So it creates a very subtle effect that you might not want, but for example, if you want a very like subtle portal kind of effect, something like this, and have like a pretty small scale, you can have this kind of effect here. I'm gonna speed it up so we can see it better, but this is the idea. So if you use the mix blending, you can have this kind of like void effect. Next, we have the color shader. So let's enable the shader and see what it does. This basically lets you alter the color of the object you are applying it on. So let's start with a 0 speed to see what the sliders do. So the glow applies a glow effect. So if you set to 0 is as it was like with no shader enabled. With the glow, the object will be glowy. If the lighting was a bit darker on the scene, you will see like a bit more this effect. We have then the hue shift, which will shift the hue of the color. And then we have the flicker and animation range, which we're going to look at right now. So if we set the hue shift to something that's like not 0, and we enable a bit of speed, let's do 0.5 so it's more visible, you can see that the hue is going to shift between some values, and the glow as well is going to shift between some values. If I set the glow higher, it's going to be more apparent that it's like glowing on and off. This animation range, it's how far away from the initial value it's going to animate. So if we go 1, it's going to do like all the colors. If we do 0.7, it's basically going to stay on this color and just like slightly variate from it. You can also enable the flicker if you want like this kind of like strobe effect. I'm not sure if you are going to use it for something, but like it's there if you have a very low speed and you enable the flicker. You can maybe have like a flickering light effect or something. The next shader we're going to look at is the mask shader. What this shader will do is basically apply a texture on top of your model, your terrain, but it will apply a mask. If you're not familiar with the concept, a mask, it's basically a black and white image where when you're going to apply your texture to the model, only the parts that are white in the image will be applied to the object as the selected texture. I realize this is probably very confusing. I'm just going to show you how it works, and it's actually way simpler when you see it. So let's say we want to paint some grass onto this. So let's say we want some like yellow grass patches here. So we select our texture here. Our next step is we enable this shader. And now we're gonna click this. You can select your own image if you want, but you can simply paint it here. So you're gonna get this interface. You can directly paint on this canvas here, but you can also paint directly onto your object, which is way easier. So you click and drag, and you will get this. So the first paint is gonna refresh the tile and set it into like this preview mode, and everything you paint after that is gonna be on this nice live preview here. So you can basically go around and paint whatever you want with your mouse here, and it will simply place the texture on top of it. It's as simple as that. And as you can see, while I do this, it's generating my mask onto this image. So after you've done this, you can simply save this image by hitting like the save button here. You pick whatever folder you want. I'm just gonna place in this splatter folder, and it's gonna save it as an image. And now we have this permanently in, and we can change something here. So we change the repeat of our texture. We can have a way more dense texture, and you can do this before you paint, of course, if you wanted. And this way you can have like this, like kind of nice high resolution texture because it's repeated many times at very little cost to performance. So instead of using like a 4K texture or 8K texture to achieve this kind of effect, you can use a very small texture, repeat it a lot of times, and have this kind of like nice effect on top. You can also colorize the texture if you want like to tint it a bit. Our next shader is going to be the noise shader. This one is a bit complicated to figure out, but I think that like looking at it in practice is going to help understanding it more than any theoretical explanation. But basically it's going to pick up two mask textures, which are these noise textures here, which work the same way as our mask we used before. It's going to add them together, scroll them in different directions, and use the product of this operation to apply a third texture. So here I've already selected a texture. It's just like a black texture here. So we can easily see what's going on here. And now we're going to select the noise texture. So first, I'm going to enable this, and I'm going to select the first noise texture. So you don't want this kind of texture here. You want the noise textures, which are located in here. So if you go to modules, comes to the compendium, assets, heat maps, you're going to have all this, all these kind of things here. So we are going to use something very obvious, maybe. Marble is not super obvious, but something like milky is pretty obvious. So you're going to pick like this one, and we select this file. So at the moment, we just have one texture, so it's not going to do anything. To make it more simple to understand at first, I'm going to pick the same texture 2 times. And you can see that we have like this same texture scrolling in different directions on the map. And we can repeat it to make it more obvious of what is going on here. But this texture is basically being repeated. Unfortunately, this specific texture is not seamless. So you should probably use like larger scales or something. But this is what you can do. And these are scrolled in different directions. So if we pick a different texture here, like a manifold, for example, we can have like even more different effects. We can like kind of mix our effects here. There are like some purling noise. There's like a bunch of different noise you can add together to create this effect. And once you have this, what you're going to do is basically have a third texture. So now we have this black texture, but let's actually pick something that makes it even more clear. We can use, for example, let's use this sand, which is probably going to be pretty obvious. We hit apply. You can see that we have this like kind of effect going on top of our texture. And you can kind of use this to create more advanced effects. You're rarely going to use this effect, I think, but if you find that you want to create some kind of custom effect, you can use this. I've told you that like you should not use these textures, but you can actually use these ones if you really wanted to. So for example, if we use this and hit apply, like it's gonna work just fine. And this has the advantage that it's like it's correctly tiled as a texture, and it's gonna create this nice effect that you can use on top of things to create weird stuff. Like this, for example, it's very simple, right? It's just like a water texture, but like what if we make it like bluish and this becomes like the effect to use on a portal or on a dome or like on a force field? This can be so many things. And there are some other parameters you can invert, which basically makes the mask inverted. So the only parts that go through are these ones. And you can change the strength. So if you want to make it like way more subtle, you can make more subtle. And you can have a mask threshold, which is going to simply exclude some parts of the texture. So if the texture is like not the white point is not like high enough, it's going to simply cut it off. So what it's going to do is basically get rid of the like kind of fading effect. It's going to make the edges of the mask more straight with like less blur, basically. But there you go. This is basically, this is also a new shader. It's first time I'm showing it as of the recording of this video. And it's pretty neat. You can do like a lot of custom things with it. I hope you have fun with it. Our next shader is going to be the overlay shader. You might be asking, okay, why are you not on the shader page? Because we have a nice tool here in the utility tab of the asset browser that's going to apply some overlays for us. So this can be a bit complicated to configure, but with this thing, you can just like one click apply the overlay. So I'm going to show you what, like the actual configuration after, but If you just click this, grassy, for example, just going to apply this grassy overlay, dirty overlay, sandy overlay, and so on. So if you have Bailey assets installed, it's also going to apply some of these other overlays. Now, you can see that it's just applying this blanket texture on top of this object. And we have some options we can configure to make the shader look better. So let's head in here in our overlay shader, and we can see that we have a lot of stuff here to tweak to make this shader behave differently. This is like already a terrain, so we're gonna disable the shader for now here, and we're gonna use one of the rock formations. So I'm just gonna pick up this rock formation here. So this is just a fucking massive model. So I'm just gonna scale it down significantly in order to show this. And let's say we have a rock formation here in our scene. And now we're gonna play with the shaders. So now, still using our magic overlays here, we can apply the grassy one, and you can see that the grass is only applied to this surface. So on this one, you were seeing that it was applied to the whole thing. It's because this surface here didn't have enough vertical inclination to be excluded from the shader. And all these shaders, if we change them, they can make the surfaces very, very different. We have this dust, we have these cobwebs, we have this blood, and we have this cracked, and we have these vines. So these vines, instead, they are only on vertical surfaces. That's why you were not seeing them here, but they're not on the more flat surfaces. So let's go back. I accidentally applied it to my water. Back to this one, which is the most basic, so we can see what this does. So we go here, we have our overlays, and it's enabled. We have a texture, which is, as you can see, we have this nice new preview here that if you hover over, it shows you the texture on the side. We have our grass texture. The color is white. This means that the texture is not tinted, but if we change to red, it's gonna multiply the colors. It's not really great on stuff that's already heavily colored. We have the strength. So this is going to change how much this is applied. It's basically the opacity of the overlay. The coverage percentage, which is going to determine how much of the surface, starting from the bottom or from the top in this case, depending on which side you go of this slider, is going to be used. So let's make this more clear. So if it's at 1, the whole thing is going to be applied to the whole model. As we go lower and lower, you can see that the top is slowly shaved off. And the more we approach to 0, the more the stuff is not gonna be applied. Once we reach 0, at which point there is nothing, we can go into the negative, and it starts appearing from the top. So the more we go into the negative, the more it's gonna cover top to bottom with this effect. Next, we have the inclination, which means which surface should be applied to. So if we go higher with this, it's more and more horizontal surfaces, as you can see. And if we go lower and lower, it's going to cover the whole thing. And if we go negative, as before, it's going to cover the vertical surfaces. So we start at 1. At maximum, it's only whatever is fully horizontal. We start decreasing, and it's going to take up more and more and more. And we go into the negative, and it starts shaving off the flat surfaces until we get to the minimum, which is only the vertical surfaces. Okay, I'm going to leave it at 0.6 here. Then we have the repeat, which, as always, is how many times that is repeated. If we go 1, it's going to be very big. Go back to 9. Rotation is the rotation of the texture, so we can rotate the overlay if we want it in a different direction for some reason. We can offset our texture. If we use multiples of 1, it's not going to do anything. Or if we use 0.5, it's going to move by half the texture. And we go back. And then we have some blending modes. Black blending, this is going to do only the highlights, basically. Additive blending is going to add it to the texture. And we have multiply blending, which is going to do this. So this texture specifically is very bad for the blending modes. Generally, you're probably not going to use the blending modes that much, but they are there in the event that you need the blending modes. I'm going to show one last thing. I accidentally duplicated this. One last thing for this. So this is one usage for the nature object, but you have like a crate of some kind. We have many crates here. Just like let's just pick this crate. I'm just gonna make it bigger. I'm gonna open my asset browser again and go to the utility and apply the cracks here. And you can see it applies this crack thing. Unfortunately, because this because there is this specific model has no texture, you're gonna have to apply some texture to it. Otherwise, the shader needs to use some texture, or it will not work. So it will by default apply a white texture. So if you apply a texture, you will see that now you have your cracked box, which is pretty nice. And you can have a lot of variation, change the scale, make the cracks bigger, more cracks, less cracks. You can kind of do whatever you want with this. So if we repeat one, we have larger cracks. You can use it on a bridge. You can use it on some rocks. You can use it kind of on whatever, as you have seen. For our next shader, we have the color swap shader. This shader is, as the name suggests, is going to swap a color for a different color. So in this example, we have this tree with these reddish leaves. Let's say we want these leaves to be a different color. As you know, you can apply a tint color to this, but it's going to apply to everything. And if you make it, for example, green, it's going to just add the colors together and create some brownish color. We don't want that. We want just to replace this with a vibrant color or something. So let's enable the color swap shader. As this is defaulted to red, it's going to immediately do this. And as you can see, it has replaced the color of the leaves with this blue, and the trunk is completely untouched. Of course, you can choose kind of what color you wish here and have this different kind of color tree. And it's going to completely replace the color. It's not going to do some weird mixing. It's just going to do this. And let's get this kind of bluish here. You can see we also have this threshold. So this is going to tell the shader how close to this source color do you want me to be before I replace it. So as you can see, if we decrease it, it's the red is going to start to kind of appear. So you want to basically set your threshold so that everything you want to replace is replaced, but that nothing you don't want replaced, if I set it to height, is gonna, as you can see, it's gonna pick up the brownish color of the trunk as well. But we don't want that, so if we set it to this 0.4 value, it's gonna replace without replacing too much. And you can use this with up to 3 different, you can replace up to 3 different colors. And you can use this on tokens as well. Sometimes, though, it can be a bit difficult to apply this shader correctly, but let's see if we can try to use it on this token as well. So we go to Effects, Configure Shaders, and we go to our color swap. We enable it. So by default, it seems it's going to replace the reddish color of the skin. But let's say we want to actually replace the green of the shield. As you can see, it's now picking up a lot of stuff. So you have to check with your threshold here what color you have to replace, because these colors, even though they don't look similar to a human eye, they are very similar to a machine. So the suggestion here is that if you pick a more obvious version of this color, such as pure grain, for example, and you increase the threshold, hopefully you will get it to replace this shield color without touching everything else. Sometimes it can be a bit hard to find which color works better for replacing. Because of the lighting and everything else, you cannot really directly pick a color here from with the color picker. Is not going to work because this is not the real color of the texture that is like being used under the hood. But I'm just going to showing you this to show you some of the challenges that come with this specific shader, because it's not easy to pick up what is green here, for example. It might be obvious to human eyes, but it's not always obvious to the machine that's running this code in our GPUs. And specifically, the shader is mostly meant if you have some more obvious kind of objects you want to recolor, such as like tents that have like a specific highlight color that is extremely visible. As we've seen with the tree before, the tree works pretty well, but some of these objects like this token are pretty hard to pick up. With like a lot of fiddling, you're probably gonna manage to change the color of the shield at some point, but sometimes it's simply not worth the effort. But it's nice knowing that the color swap shader is there if you want to fiddle with it or use it or change some primary color of something. But keep in mind that generally, when you want to change a color with the color swap shader, the color needs to be very evident and very clearly different from every other color on the object. It needs to be the highlight color. I will briefly touch on the next shader, which is the Triplanar shader. And I will briefly touch on it because it's scheduled to be removed at some point. So I'm just going to explain it because it's there. But I encourage you to not use it unless it's for like a map that you just need for like this session, and that's it. So this shader basically tries to solve these issues. If you have like this cube, you can see I've applied a rock texture on it, and on the top it's completely fine, but on the side it's very stretched. And this can apply to like any other 3D model, but like I just made this to make it very obvious. What this shader does is, when you enable it, it will map the texture so that it doesn't create that stretching effect. And that's basically all it's gonna do. And as you can see, when I stretch this, the texture, you see that it remains in the same spot. It's not like, it's not repeating, it's just getting mapped by this shader in a specific way. So that's it for a triplanar shader. There's not much to it. You have the reflection adjustment if the highlights are too strong or too weak, because sometimes it can create this kind of artifacting effects. And let's open the Splatmap shader. So I'm not gonna go super in depth into this because it's basically the same as the mask shader. So if you haven't seen the mask shader, go back and check that one out. I'm not gonna re-explain the whole thing because it's basically the same thing. It's a mask applying that's being applied on to paint textures. So let's pick up like quickly. Let's do grass, and then let's do snow, and let's do bricks. So let's just pick like some random brick. There we go. So let's add like the repeat to 10. This is the usual texture repeat, and I'm gonna explain now what this whole thing is. But basically, what this does is, as the mask texture, it picks up whatever like is whiter and use it as a mask to apply a texture. Except in this case, it's 3 separate masks. Each one, instead of being white, one is a red channel, one is the blue channel, and one is the green channel. So let me show you. As you can see, we are assigning the texture here. So we have the texture for the red channel is gonna be our grass. and it's going to be repeated 10 times, and we can have like a tint here for the texture. For our green channel, we have the snow, and for the blue channel, we have the bricks. One important thing to do, remember to enable this flip Y if you're going to paint the splat map like you do with the mask. And now we can check out what this does. We have an extra option, which is use alpha channel and the texture for the alpha channel, but you cannot use this while using the paint mode. This is only for textures that are generated externally. You can pretty much ignore this like alpha part of the shader. So let's enable this and let's paint our splat map. So like before, we have our paintbrush here. By clicking on this thing, on this color palette, we can switch between the three textures. And as you can see, if we paint in red, we are painting the grass. If we paint in green, we are painting the snow. And if we paint in blue, you guessed it, we are painting the bricks. And you can use this to create things such as roads or stuff like that on your scenes. And it works exactly the same as the mask texture, as the mask shader we've shown before. You have some things such as the brush size here, if you want to make it smaller. You have the opacity if you want like very strong edges. Same with the feathering. This gives you super strong edges. The brush hardness, I meant, sorry. And the brush color, in this specific case, it's not going to do much except changing basically the opacity. So when you are in this red, green, and blue painting mode, this slider is kind of useless. Just leave it at 100 and just use the opacity if you need to do so. And yes, this is going to paint this texture. So once you're done, you can save this as always. I'm just going to slap it into the splatter folder. And now we can still change after the fact this texture. So if you're like now, okay, yeah, I don't really like this bricks. I just want my asphalt in there, right? So you just hit that, apply, and now you have asphalt in there. You want to change the texture to make it like bigger. You can do that. And if you want, you can repeat this splat map. It's generally you're just not gonna use this generally because you're gonna use it to paint roads and such. But if you want to repeat it 2 times, you can repeat it 2 times. And then we have the only up-facing surface, which you can enable to basically limit exclude the very, very straight vertical surfaces from this thing. So let me show you what I mean. So if I close this, and if we go to this dial, it's a bit complicated to show on this specifically. Oh, there we go. This side is perfect. So normally you would have it painted on this like flat sides as well. When you do only vertical surfaces, you're gonna only be showing this painted stuff on this top side. So this side is not gonna have it. And if we had like other sides, it's very barely visible here, but we don't have any painting in here. So if we have that, if we were to have that disabled, these sides will also like basically show the same painting on the sides, which you usually don't want when painting a terrain. So remember that if you're gonna use the Splatmap shader to paint a terrain, enable the flip Y and enable the only vertical to have the best results. For our next shader, we have the gradient shader. So we have one already pre-configured here because it is the shader that is used when you generate terrain using the terrain panel. So whenever you apply a theme, all this is doing is simply applying a gradient shader here. So let's see what this does. Let's close this to have more space because this is a pretty large shader. Of course, we have the enabled and we have the texture count, which determines how many of these textures we are using, these texture slots. If you're not using all of them, you can reduce it to reduce basically GPU usage. That's kind of the long and short of it. So if you're using 3 texture, like in this case, which you set texture count to 3, and you have your 3 textures here. So we have, this is like a ground texture, we have a grass texture, and we have a different grass texture. So if we examine this before we go in depth here, you can see that we have one texture that is here, which is the last one we are using. We have this middle, more green grass texture, which is this one. And then we have the last texture, which is this ground/rock we are using here. So what are all these sliders? We're going to get to use inclination later, but let's start from the smoothing here, which is the very visual. This is how much textures are smooth between each other. So if we reduce it, you can see there is like less of a blurring effect between the textures. If we set it very high, there is a lot of blurring here. This is very simple and visual to understand. So let's go into the more obscure things. This is the texture begin sliders. So depending on if we're using inclination or not, these are going to behave differently. So let's imagine that there is an arrow that is perpendicular to this surface. So on this surface here, the arrow is going to point completely up, same as this surface is basically completely up, while this is going to be a bit like horizontal here. And this number is basically, the more this arrow is pointing up, then show me this texture. So if the arrow is pointing up, the value of the, let's call it the value of the arrow is going to be 1. If it's completely horizontal, it's going to be 0. So we have this first texture, which is going to begin at 0, which is the completely horizontal, and it's going to go on until the next texture, which is at 0.7. So when the inclination is 0.7, so horizontal, but horizontal, but not yet completely vertical, this second texture here is going to start. And then the third texture is going to start whenever this is completely flat. So in this example, this is like not going to change much if you go lower because it's covered by the previous texture. But let's change this. So if we change this to a higher value, you see that this side is getting more and more covered by this rock dirt kind of thing. If we go lower, it's going to be taken over. The second texture, the grass texture is going to take over because it's more and more okay to go on vertical surfaces. So as I said, 0 is when the surface is pointing horizontally, it's not flat, it's a vertical surface. And as we go up on this value, it's going to take surfaces that are more and more flat. So because this surface here is very vertical, it's not going to be covered by our texture 2, which is this like a thicker grass, the greener grass. And if we go, the more we go up, the more it's going to not use the vertical surface. So you see here, we have this like middle like inclination that's now it's being covered. But if we go down, the more we go down, the more it's going to cover the vertical surface. And it's going to cover up, it's going to go above the first texture. So the ground texture is going to be covered. And the more we go up, the more it's going to cover the flat surfaces. For simplicity, let's set the texture count to 2. So we just have these 2 textures. So as we said before, this ground texture starts at 0. That means like this is basically our base texture. If we set our second texture to 0, it's going to completely cover the first texture. And now observe as we go up with this slider, as soon as we reach a certain threshold here, because we don't have super vertical surfaces, so it's going to take up to like 0.5 to start showing up. The second texture, which is the green one, is gonna start not when the surface is vertical, but when it's a bit more flat. And as we go up on this one, it's gonna require an even flatter surface to be applied. And if we go up to 1, it's gonna apply only on the very flattest of surfaces, giving us this nice effect. And of course, you can do this with multiple textures to get the desired effect. In this case, we have 3 textures, so we have the flat texture, which is the last one, which starts at 0.9389 flatness, and the other ones go and create this like nice gradient of different textures. If we don't have the use inclination enabled, these sliders are going to be percentage of the height. So let's disable this. And see what's happening here. So let's imagine that the maximum height of this is 1. This is a percentage. So the ground here is 0 and the top is 1. So if we place these 3 sliders like this, you can see that we have this first texture, which is starting at 0, and it's ending at 0.1, which is roughly here. And at 0.1, we have our second texture, this grass, starting. And at 0.4, we have our last texture starting here. So if we make this smaller, this will be starting before. And this is the difference between using or not using inclination. Most of the times, you're going to be having inclination enabled, because it's going to usually create the more organic and natural effect. Each texture, as always, has the tint color if you want to tint the texture, and the repeat to make the texture more or less dense. So here we have a super dense grass. We can have a super dense ground. But yeah, be careful to not go too overboard with the density, because you're going to start seeing repetition pretty clearly. Last shader is going to be the sound shader. This is one of the most weird and situational shaders you will ever encounter. I don't know if you have any use for this, but I'm going to show you what it does anyways. As the name suggests, it uses the sound that's playing in a playlist to change the object. So I have it open on this like house. So let's enable it. As you can see, it's not going to do anything in the beginning, but I'm just going to play this Undertale remix. And as you can see, it's going to move following the music. Now I'm going to set my volume to 0, so we can still have the animation, but no sound playing. And we have some values here. We can change the intensity. Of course, this is going to change how much it's going to scale up and down with the sound. We can give it a glow, which is basically going to add a glowing effect that goes with the music. You can have a chroma, which is going to change the color based on the music. This is mostly it. We have the flat bottom, which means the object is going to expand from the bottom instead from the center. If we disable it, the house is going to just expand from the center instead of the bottom. So I hope you enjoyed this shader guide. I hope it covers any questions you might have on the shaders, any usage that might be unclear or too complicated. I hope I did a decent job in explaining this. And enjoy playing with shaders, enjoy combining them. You can enable multiple shaders together. Mostly you can you cannot enable all the shaders on a single object, but you can enable like most shaders on a single object, because there is a hard limit on how many texture the GPU can load for a single object. But I hope you had fun combining all the shaders to create incredible effects, portals, set things on fire, make things frosted, make your crates cracked, and wherever your imagination brings you.